Dangerously Close.
My guest today is Madeline Ostrander. Madeline is a science journalist and author of At Home on an Unruly Planet, which tells the stories of 4 American communities on the front lines of the climate crisis and reflects on what it means to make a home in this era of upheaval and transition. At Home on an Unruly Planet is one of Kirkus Review's 100 best nonfiction books of 2022. What's up, Madeline?
Hi. Thanks for having me here.
Thank you for being here. Hey, I just read your book.
Yeah?
Yeah, and I loved it.
Awesome. Thank you. I'd like to hear that.
You want to talk about it?
Sure.
Let's just kick it off. I was going to say, it seems like most people have been conditioned to think of the climate crisis as a far off scientific concept. You know, people are always like, the glaciers will melt someday. Someday it will be, 2 degrees hotter. That's how it's been my whole life. It's always felt like something they're talking about that's going to happen when I'm a very old man or dead, or it's, that it's a problem for the future. But is it fair to say that your book makes the case that the future is here as far as climate crises are concerned?
Well, so I would say that the climate crisis is certainly here. And I mean, unfortunately, the future, the impacts are going to get worse. I mean, that's kind of a scientific guarantee because of the pollution we've already put in the atmosphere. But all that said, I think there's a couple messages of the book. One is, the climate crisis is here. We can see it right in front of us in the form of wildfires and huge storms and like major billion-dollar disasters that we're having every year, and heat waves. Like this last summer, a huge percentage of the country dealt with heat waves. Some of them pretty severe. And I think part of the message of the book is that we still have choices about the future and about how it unfolds and about how we experience these crises and disasters. So I wanted people to be able to understand it at a scale that felt real to them. So the book focuses on communities and on home and on places that people can identify with and see and understand what it means to live there.
Yeah, and you live in Seattle, right?
I do.
I think you brought up some points just about so Seattle's a place that's like kind of my home away from home. I'm there every year. Usually, I used to be there at least twice a year. Now it's more like once a year. But for the longest time, it always seemed like a place like super mild summers, super mild winters. Like I was like, this is kind of the perfect place to live for me, like because I like rain too, so I loved it. But with the heat waves that are happening there, like because I'm always up there for the solstice parade and those kind of things, and in recent years it's been like that one heat wave where it's like 100 degrees every day. And I'm originally from Tucson, Arizona. Like that's what the weather's like there. But like
in 2021 the Pacific Northwest heat dome, it got to be like 108, I believe, in Seattle. And I write about that in the book at the end. It was awful, really. And not, I think people who live in really warm places might roll their eyes at that idea. But the thing is, we're not, one, physically, if you live in a cool climate, you're not ready for that kind of heat. And so it becomes really dangerous. And 2, there's not a lot of air conditioning in Seattle. So our houses are not built for that. And it's been really shocking. We had another one actually the week that my book came out, or the week before. There was a heat wave of several days, and I lived in the Midwest for part of my life. I thought, oh, this is no big deal. I know how to deal with heat. And then I found myself feeling a bit of heat exhaustion after a few days of it because I just wasn't physically prepared for that kind of heat. And we are getting a lot more of those kinds of things like everywhere across the country. And heat waves are actually one of the most dangerous, probably the most dangerous natural disaster. I think people don't recognize that a lot of the time.
Oh, yeah. And I mean, like you were saying too, like people that already live in really hot places, they're like, oh, come on, shut up 100 degrees. But I mean, this is affecting everywhere. And like I said, I'm originally from Tucson and I spent a lot of time in Arizona. And I remember one of the hottest I've ever been has been in Phoenix. And I would say that's every time the hottest I've ever been, it's always been in Phoenix because it's like the hottest place I've ever been. It's also the most rapidly rising in temperature city in the United States. but I many years ago I went there with my brother when I was a kid. We went to Warped Tour, which the people of the city of Phoenix decided to throw in a parking lot like outside of a stadium. It's like on asphalt. And I was literally, I thought I was gonna die the whole time, and I was trying to have so much fun because it's it was like a punk rock and but uh, I had a point there, but I'm actually going to digress from how hot Phoenix is and go back to the reason I even brought up that you're from Seattle is because you start off the book talking about wildfires in the
Uh-huh.
Pacific Northwest. And massive wildfires are obviously some of the most visceral indicators of climate change. Why did you choose wildfires as a starting point for your book? When was that maybe one of the reasons? Because they're so just vivid in people's minds when they think of a massive fire.
So I guess just to give a little bit of context about the book, the book tells the stories of four communities, and they each go through a different aspect of a crisis that's related to the climate crisis. So I do start out with wildfires, and there's a community we'll talk about in a bit, I imagine, that goes through floods, and another that deals with thaw, and another that deals with kind of like an fossil fuel industry accident or a series of them. And in the first part of the book, people are dealing with this crisis. And in the second part of the book, there's this realization that we're all living in kind of a new world that's affected by climate crises. And so, what do we do about that? And so, the second part of the book is kind of a search for solutions. So, I guess I started with wildfires because, in a large part, because it's the closest example to my home. And so, it was a way that I could tell readers that I have a stake in this too. I'm not just writing this as a passive outside observer, but like I
Yeah.
am part of this world that we're living in, where we're all being affected by, in my case, smoke and heat. And if you go further inland, or I mean, not, you don't even have to go further inland. There are communities on the west side that have been dealing with pretty major wildfires in the last few years as well. But when you go inland, there's more fire-prone communities. And so I focused on this one area of Washington state that's had huge catastrophic megafires, multiple megafires over the last decade, and how they've dealt with those, and how they've dealt with recovery, and how that's changed how they think about themselves. And it was a way of giving people a story they could relate to immediately, but also letting people know that this is close to my home too.
Yeah. I maybe should have brought up earlier when I was just first, saying at home on an Unruly Planet that this is not just a book, a collection of stories of doom. And like, oh, it's over, despair, which is what a lot of people kind of expect to hear when you bring up. That's why I think a lot of people have like shut off their minds to hearing about climate change at this point, because it's maybe they're getting fatigued by hearing over and over again that it's hopeless. The fossil fuel industries are too powerful. They control too many politicians. There's too much dark money. There's nothing you can do, and that's not the case with this book. This book is a book of hope, or that's how I interpret it. Is yes, there's all this, there's these disasters and scary things, and people lose their lives and homes and stuff, but ultimately this is a book of we're an adaptable species, and we are the stewards of this planet, like it or not. So I don't know if is that fair to say?
Yeah, when I was thinking about the audience of the book, I was thinking about some interviews I'd done with the scientists and social scientists who work at the Yale program on climate change communication. They do a series of studies on public opinion about climate change, and they divide the American public into these different segments. And one of those segments is called the alarmed. And I think at the time that I was writing the book, the alarmed was about 25% of the American public, and it continues to grow. So it's more
Mm-hmm.
than that now. I don't have the figure in front of me, but those are the Americans who are, I mean, that's a lot of people. You think about 25%
Yeah.
of adults. So there's a huge part of the population that is really worried about climate change. And some significant percentage of those folks don't really know what to do about it. They're really worried, but they're just stuck with this worry. And so I wanted to write a book partly for people who see what's going on around them. They see that we're dealing with these impacts that are getting worse, so like wildfires and flooding. And they want a sense of how do we live now in this world. And in a way, maybe I wrote it for myself as well, because I have that
Yeah.
same feeling sometimes. Like, what do we do now? As someone who writes about these things all the time, I wanted to give people a sense of power, that they weren't just hapless in the face of all these things.
Yeah, and and sometimes these facts and figures can be very frustrating. Because what you just brought up, I actually just very recently had a guest on this podcast who he has an organization called the Environmental Voter Project, and the purpose of it is to get more people to vote along the lines of environmentalism, and they focus specifically on non-voters, people that don't vote at all, but environmentalism is a concern of theirs. But if you look at just Americans in general, most people care about climate change, and most people are concerned about it. But if you the way they break it down, because it's all this behavioral science and a lot of stuff that I don't super understand how they get to these figures, but these talking about, like, in these major elections, it'll be like 2% of the voters, the environment is their primary concern. So the elected officials, the people that are running for office, they don't focus on the environment because they don't have that motivation that's in front of them, because some other issue is going to gain them more votes. So I guess
it's actually even more complicated than that in some ways. And you're right, these figures get a little messy. And I should clarify that when I said that there's this segment of the alarmed, like, those are the people that are like, they wake up at night worrying about the climate crisis. The people who are the most worried, or the people who are willing to go out in the streets and march, or the people who say, I want to start a solar company, or the people who are just, it's not necessarily defined by what they're doing, but it's the people who are by far the most concerned about climate change. It's the thing that keeps them up at night. But yes, the majority of the country is concerned about climate change. So there's another big segment that's, I believe they're called the concerned. When you add them all up, when you add up all of the people, the majority of people in the country are concerned about and understand that climate change is affecting them. But then when you get to voting, things divide up along partisan lines. Democrats are actually really concerned about the climate crisis, but I think that the Democratic Party perhaps sometimes takes that as a given. And so it's not an issue they have to campaign on perhaps sometimes.
Yeah.
And depending on what's happening with the economy or what's happening with the pandemic, people don't always think of it as the thing that makes them make a decision. And I think some of that is just articulating to people, how do they connect the dots? Like, Jonathan Foley, who's a climate scientist, writes about how climate change needs to be a kitchen table issue. Like, people need to understand how it's related to in their immediate lives. And so, that's also part of why I wrote the book the way that I did, is so people could see this is how it's affecting people in their homes at a scale that, like, I can relate to. And so that's why it should be important to me.
Yeah, absolutely. You can keep just pushing this out further and further. I did do an episode last summer called it, I forgot exactly the title of it, Dismantling the Machinery of Mass Extinction. We read Andreas Malm's book, How to Blow Up a Pipeline, and did a just analysis of it. But at the same time, I was really concerned. I was like, I want to make sure that it's very clear to everyone that these are all hypothetical things that I'm saying. I'm not, I'm like, in case the FBI is listening, I'm not saying blow up a pipeline. And he's safe over in Switzerland with his ideas. But sorry, moving back to your book, and we're back to the wildfires. I was going to say, can you tell me about some of the people that you met in the Pacific Northwest while researching your book, and how they're choosing to react to the increasing occurrence and the devastation of mega fires?
Yeah, there's a few different people whose stories I follow really closely in the book. One of them is Susan Pritchard. She's a scientist. She's a forest ecologist. And one of the interesting things about her story is that she started studying climate change in the 1990s, and she started studying what the model said about it, the impacts on wildfire. And so she could see this coming, right? Like so many scientists, she could see this coming and knew that there were going to be more and more big fires and really intense fires. But it's very different to know it hypothetically and then see it come to your home. So in 2006, there was a big megafire in the wilderness near her home, which is on on the east side of the mountains here in Washington State. And then in 2014, there was this massive fire, still the largest on record in Washington State, called the Carlton Complex, which burned all around the area that she lived in. And so she's viewing these impacts from wildfire both as a scientist and also as a, it's just a person who lives there. So there's the emotional impact, and then there's her understanding as a researcher. But one of the things she studies is how certain kinds of practices and certain kinds of strategies can actually make a lot of forests and a lot of ecosystems better able to withstand fires and less likely to have great, big, intense, hot fires. And some of those strategies and practices, like prescribed fire, go back many, many generations to the way that Indigenous people used to manage the landscapes in North America. But there's a ton of, I should say, and in addition, there's a ton of scientific evidence also about how effective those kinds of strategies are. And in her mind, and in talking with her, I could understand that she had a really hopeful vision of how we could restore a lot of landscapes across the country and protect ourselves against having really bad fires, which isn't to say that we're not going to have fires. We're always going to have fires. These landscapes are landscapes that have been shaped by fire. And I think that's maybe something that gets lost when people understand how this is happening. They think, oh, we're having these terrible wildfires now. There's always been wildfires in the West. But I think,
there was something in your book, and I may have heard it before, but this has been so long and it seemed very new to me again. And I don't remember exactly which type of tree you were saying it was, but the seeds of that tree, like the acorns on that tree, they don't germinate unless they've been in a fire.
There's a bunch of different plants and trees that are like that. There's certain kinds of pines that have cones that open up after they've been exposed to heat.
That's what it was.
The sequoias also, so giant sequoias, germinate. Really, they germinate after wildfire. So in Sequoia National Park, for instance, when they had a wildfire come through, there were all these little baby sequoias that sprouted everywhere. It was really beautiful.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, those of us who live in the West live in a place that's defined by wildfire. And I think part of that part of the book is to come to terms with the fact that we also live in an ecosystem that we have to take care of. And then one of the other characters I follow in that part of the book is a firefighter and a small town mayor named Carleen Anders. And she leads her community through this incredible recovery process after the fire wipes out a huge part of her hometown along the Columbia River. And that effort to rebuild houses and raise money and help people just clean up and also help people think about how do we prepare for the next wildfire, because I think there's now an understanding that fire is going to keep coming. That effort has become a model for communities around the country. So she goes consulting in different places. Like she's gone to work with folks in Paradise, and she's gone to work with folks in other parts of Washington State that were really heavily hit by fires in 2020. So I chose to focus on her story because it's both a beautiful story and it also offers a lot of lessons about what it means to withstand these kinds of disasters and come out the other side of them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do so much love that you take the time to talk about Indigenous people in that region. And you do so in other parts of the book as well, including in Florida, but particularly prescribed fires. And just the fact that, the people that were here first, that were living in harmony with the land, they had it right the first time.
Yeah, one of the places that gets a mention in the book, and I've done some more extensive reporting there also for a magazine piece that I did, is the Colville Reservation, which is this huge reservation in central Washington that crosses over into Okanogan County. And they've had a lot of really big wildfires. And also they have one of the most successful prescribed fire programs probably in the country. They've done a ton of work to restore thousands, I think hundreds of thousands maybe of acres of forest. And it's also economical for them. They run a really great sustainable forestry program. And so that knowledge is still there. I mean, those communities are still actively doing that kind of work. And when I've talked to folks on the Culver Reservation, I mean, that people have lost homes from wildfire, but I think there's an understanding that the impact could have been a lot worse if they hadn't done those kinds of forest restoration programs and those kinds of wildfire readiness efforts. So yeah, all of those lessons are still there, and there's a lot of tribes that are actively doing that kind of work.
Yeah, it's like in many ways there's like we've had the answers forever, we've just forgotten the answers, and we just have to return to them.
Yeah, we've neglected them, I think, really.
I mean, I know we could go on with mega fires and forest fires for a long time, but I want to get to some of the other locations in the book, and so let's just jump from mega fires to floods. I guess that's kind of I think that's the way you did it in the book too, which I think is a good transition. Like give your brain a break from fire. But you chose St. Augustine as the location that you were like because you're doing this kind of like individual people's lives and individual locations. And why did you choose St. Augustine?
Well, so St. Augustine is one of the most historic cities in the country. It was founded in the 1500s by the Spanish, and it just has layers and layers of American history that are part of that landscape. I mean, partly I chose it the way that I think writers and journalists choose things, which is that something comes up and you get an opportunity to go to a place. St. Augustine had a conference that was really fascinating called Keeping History Above Water, which is all about how do you save historic places from sea level rise. It's an interesting,
cool,
a niche conference, right? But actually there's hundreds of experts from across the country that turn up to these from different fields who try to think about how do we protect these historic places from flooding, and what kind of engineering strategies can we use, and how do historic preservationists deal with these new kinds of threats. And so it was a really interesting moment to go to St. Augustine and talk to lots of people who are working in this area and thinking about how do we protect a place like this. And when I got there, I found these really extraordinary people who were both working as professionals to protect the city of St. Augustine, and it was their home. So they cared about it, again, on multiple levels. They cared about it as people who care about history, and also they cared as people who live there. And then I think just in terms of the theme of the book, like a historic place is a really interesting place to talk about what it means to be affected by climate change at home, because home and history are intertwined. Like home isn't just a place or a house. It's meaning. It's a story. It's a place feels like home because we have a history there. And so writ large, what our communities mean and what it means to live here in this country is really affected by the history of those places. So I thought it would be an interesting place to reflect on all of these things.
Yeah. And I guess, of course, at first thought, when you said that conference, that it does sound like a niche conference, like protecting historic sites from sea level rise. But then, just like, after like a moment of thinking about it, I was like, well, I mean, Venice, Italy, New Orleans. I mean, there are a lot of, if you really start thinking about it, there's countless places that are under threat of sea level rise that are, of course, historic, because, places always get settled on the coastlines first. These kind of conferences might become something much, much larger in the future, too.
I think they are growing. And then when you think about something like Hurricane Sandy in 2012, I mean, that not only drenched a huge area of the coast, but like huge iconic historic sites, including Liberty Island, where, the Statue of Liberty is. So a lot of not the statue itself, but like the Park Service facilities were damaged. And I mean, you think about how much history is on the coast on both sides of the country and how important some of those places are. And then you start to realize this isn't just a small niche thing. There's a lot of really important places that we need to think about. How do we hang on to these, or if we are going to lose them, because we are going to lose some of them. What do we hang on to? How do we document those? How do we keep what's important?
I think one of the first things, a lot of things that happen in my mind are very cartoonish when I first think of something, and I was thinking like, protecting the historical stuff and from the rising water, And I imagine someone like grabbing a priceless painting and like running upstairs with it, or to keep it out of the water. But obviously that is not what the people in St. Augustine are talking about, or at least not for the most part. And did you come away from this with any ideas that you thought were innovative ideas? Did you feel like there were any innovative ideas that were being discovered?
I think St. Augustine is thinking about the same ideas that most cities are thinking about. And so it's a combination of how do we put out of commission land that's really flood prone, that nobody should really be building on, or that already has something on it and we should take it down. So, I mean, that's part of what, for instance, the FEMA Bio program is about, but it also happens through other means in a lot of different places. How do we lift up places that are more vulnerable? So like raising streets and putting up berms and flood control stuff. And then there's always this question out there of big infrastructure, like should we put in some massive floodgate, which is what Venice has tried to do with kind of mixed success. And that's really expensive, of course.
Yeah.
And it's something that a lot of communities can't afford. And there's always a question of, did you build it high enough?
Yeah.
Estimates of how big sea level rise are going to be and how massive, and intense storms are going to be change a lot, and conditions can change. So that gets complicated. And then there's little things like a lot of what happens with the city in flooding is that water comes up through the storm drains. So there's a lot of things to do, kind of out of sight with drains and sewers to try to keep water out. I think St. Augustine had done some really important, and I think it's probably fair to call it innovative. I mean, they'd done some really important studies and mapping to try to figure out where is the water actually going to be, and also how is that going to affect us as a historic city. So what are the properties that are most at risk, and what does that really mean? So they could have a clear-eyed sense. And they did that in a lot of detail. And I think that's really important. It's important. It's important for just a community to come to terms with what's at stake. And I think also, I mean, one of the book isn't a book of doom, but there is a bummer moment in the book where I have to acknowledge that St. Augustine and really a lot of places along the coast are ultimately, if you go decades ahead or centuries ahead, it's not clear what the time scale is yet, but
yeah,
those places are going to be underwater. We've already kind of made that choice by way of, again, the amount of pollution we've put into the atmosphere. But that can happen slower or faster, and we can buy time through some of these strategies so that people are able to adapt and move. And I think that time is important. And I think, the time to let people adjust and to try to save what matters is really important. So that's part of the lesson of the book as well.
Oh yeah. And I think you've brought this up twice now, and it's one of the, like, when we talk about like certain figures and facts being frustrating, and that's just, to me, as a layman, and someone who's just, that I'm very interested and I'm concerned, and this is an important topic to me, but I am not a scientist and I'm not a climatologist, and it must be just infuriating. I can't even describe the emotions that a lot of these scientists must feel when they just keep saying over and over again to leaders and leaders of industry, like, hey, here's data, hard facts, this is happening, and they're just ignored. And I kind of like, that's why I was very pleased with the success of the movie Don't Look Up, because I was just like, this is such I'm glad someone finally kind of made a movie that was such a perfect analogy for what's happening in real life. I mean, I know they switched it to comets, but what's the difference?
Yeah, there definitely is that tension there in the scientific community. I think, again, part of the way that I chose to write the book was to focus on what was happening in these local communities where it is more possible to get people to listen and to get people to get together and come up with solutions. And while that, I think that might sound small to some people in the face of this giant global crisis, it's not really. I had a talk recently with Bill McKibben, and he was talking about how the Inflation Reduction Act is going to have to happen community by community, like those programs that change houses over from gas to heat pumps, or electrify a lot of the country so that we're not all burning fossil fuels all the time, is going to have to be organized on a community level, because that's where people live, and we're talking about changing people's homes. So if you add all of these things up, if you take St. Augustine and you add dozens of other cities to it that learn from those kinds of strategies, and we find ways to adapt around the coast, and then you take stories like I'm sure we'll get to this in a second, but like Richmond, California, which is trying to think about how we get away from fossil fuels and have greener economies and different kinds of opportunities, and you multiply that across the country, that can get us a lot of the way to where we need to go. So
and I 100% believe in doing things on a local level, community by community. The city I live in, Nashville, Tennessee. It's a flood city. We have massive floods. There's one in particular that got us like international coverage. That might have been 10 years ago now, but we've had plenty of floods since then. But that was the one. All of downtown went underwater. You could kayak down Broadway, and and it was actually pretty sketchy, because the closer you got to the river, the more likely you could just get washed away, because it was a crazy flood. I was on the freeway when it happened, and cars were just like the ditch on the side of the road had become like its own river. And I was just watching cars about the same size as my car floating back the other way. I managed to get off the freeway. Like I got to the next exit and got stranded in some little town and just hung out at a gas station. But that's not really the point. The point is, this town is already prone to floods, and we have this, what I consider a big problem with developers. And what they're doing is they're getting rid of all the trees. Anywhere where there's trees, they cut them all away, and they build tall skinnies, those kind of San Francisco style houses, because they can put as many as possible on a lot. And I don't have the figure in front of me. I wish I should just memorize it, because I need to be able to bring it up. But it's something like over the past 10 years, they've like cut away something like 50% of the trees. And without those root systems, the floods become even more and more severe. And I'm worried. I used to be like, well, I live kind of on a hill, but now I'm like, I don't think this hill's high enough for the next. I'm going to get washed away. So people do need to think on a local level, like, what do you got to do? Who do I need to get kicked out of the city council to get rid of to get these developers some regulations? Oh, which totally brings me to the next thing I really wanted to ask you, which was obviously St. Augustine. It's a historic city. It makes sense that people are trying to save it and protect it, and they should. But you brought this up a moment ago. Why do you think developers are continuously building billions of dollars of real estate along the coastlines? Like when you said, when increased floods and sea level rise, they're just hard facts. It's only a matter of time before that land is underwater, and yet they're investing these billions.
To some extent, I think the answer to that is sort of embedded in the question. Like those billions of dollars are pretty enticing. But we have a real lag in policies about flooding and about what the responsibility of developers are. So for instance, if you're selling property on the coast or in a flood prone area, there's no federal requirement to disclose the flood history of that place or that it's flood prone. So you could sell your house to somebody and, they might not know, or, you can build a new house and just sell to someone and not give any indication of what the flood history of that is. Then I think in a lot of these states, there's been political leaders who haven't been willing to acknowledge at times the crisis that the state is facing. So in both North Carolina and Florida, there's been leaders who have either officially or unofficially directed agencies not to use words like climate change or not to acknowledge sea level rise predictions or de-emphasize all of that in planning. And so that encourages a sense, kind of a culture of not taking these kinds of impacts seriously and not connecting the dots and not being realistic about what's coming. So there's a lot of different reasons. I guess I would also say that there are a lot of communities around the coast that are doing a lot of work, like St. Augustine is doing a lot of work to do adaptation planning to try to be proactive. And the trouble is that it's not coordinated. So, I mean, there also needs to be, in addition to all of these community level efforts, there needs to be a state level and national level
Yeah.
policies and strategies about how do we do this kind of adaptation.
And I guess one thing too is I know that I'm kind of asking you to speculate on something as well though. And it like, yeah, because the answer is in the question. I know what the developers are getting out of it. They're getting the billions of dollars. But I mean, don't you feel like wouldn't a person have to be a fool to buy a condo on the coast? I mean, of course you want the beachfront property, but it's just not a good investment. I mean, obviously, like I said, I'm asking you to like speculate in the minds of thousands of people that make this
When I
industry possible.
when I was doing interviews in St. Augustine, I talked with some just residents in various neighborhoods, and in some places people some of the folks that I talked to were very savvy and knowledgeable about sea level rise, understood what was coming, were making active decisions about their houses. But in other places, people are really new. I mean, there's a lot of people that move down to Florida, of course, because it's
Yeah.
warm, or move, or North Carolina or wherever they move to seek out the sun and the warmth, and they don't have the historical context of what flooding used to look like. I guess it became clear to me that people don't always see what's in front of them, and
Yeah.
I think, I mean, not to keep going back to my rationale for the book, but I do think that that's part of what I was trying to do, is to help people see what's happening right in front of them, because
Yeah.
sometimes people see really obvious impacts. Like since the book came out, I've had conversations with various people, like just at the coffee shop or whatever, about things like heat waves, and sometimes I'll be surprised that they suddenly are connecting the dots between the heat waves and climate change.
Yeah.
They just see the connection, even though it was right in front of them. So I think we need to understand that these are happening right in front of us at home.
Yeah. And yeah, it's funny as you said, as a journalist, it's not necessarily your job to try to educate someone that you might be interviewing, but it does seem funny to be like, to say something like along the lines of like, wait till you hear about Greenland or Antarctica if you don't like
I
these
guess what I
floods.
should say is, when I'm interviewing someone, it's my job to listen to them and not soapbox. It is
Yeah.
obvious. I never want to, in the middle of an interview, sort of start haranguing at someone about climate change. It means that I'm not hearing what
Yeah.
they have.
Just to absolutely like speaking down to them, get get a very full glass of water and start filling it with ice cubes and saying, see this is the ocean. All right. We're gonna leave Florida for now.
Okay.
Uh, I'll visit again someday, maybe. I don't know. But let's talk about Alaska. Alaska does get a decent amount of coverage regarding climate change, with of course like the iconic photos of starving polar bears on ice floes. All the oil companies fighting to get pipelines in there to destroy more habitat that has been protected for, has been federally protected land for a long time. And but that's not what we're here to talk about. We're talking about the people, and that's what you don't hear a lot about, is the people in Alaska. And I was just going to ask you, can you tell me about the people you met in Alaska, how the melting permafrost is affecting their home, and what they're doing to live with the changing environment?
Yeah. So the majority of Alaska has permafrost under it. It's around 85%. And in some places it's deeper and more significant, and in other places it's sort of intermittent. But permafrost is like frozen ground, basically. It's a kind of like a type of bedrock almost, or it was supposed to be. That's a mix of ice and earth, and some of it's been there for tens of thousands of years. But because the planet is warming, and in Alaska, and as you get closer to the Arctic especially, the rate of warming, for a variety of reasons to do with I don't want to geek out too much, but the rate of warming toward the poles is much higher than it is in the latitudes that we're sitting out right now. So
Also,
it's
feel free to geek out as much as you feel like doing.
well, it's called Arctic amplification, and there scientists are studying the various causes of it, but it basically means that Alaska is warming like really fast, and it's getting really warm, and they've had just crazy temperatures up there in places that are not supposed to be. They're supposed to be frigid, right? So this permafrost under the ground has been thawing, and as it thaws, it becomes mushy and starts to fall apart. And so there's in remote parts of Alaska, there are there are more than 200 native villages across Alaska, and some of them live in very remote parts of Alaska, and some of them live on permafrost, and they live in places that are basically falling apart because of this thaw. So I went to one of these places. It's called Newtok. Newtok has been dealing with erosion and permafrost collapse for decades now. Some of it is just related to the fact that it's a very dynamic landscape. There's a big river that cuts through it, and it's a very powerful erosive force. And I follow a few different people's stories. The community is very tight knit. One of the people whose story I tell it is named Lisa Charles. She moved in with her grandmother in 1993 from Anchorage. And it was in that moment, actually, way back in 1993, that the community said, we actually need to move because there's too much erosion here. But it's taken a couple of decades for them to be able to move because of just bureaucracy and the expense of trying to move a whole community, and the fact that it really hasn't been done in a modern context in the way that they need to do it. They need to have a school, they need to have a post office, they need to have a healthcare center. So it's taken a very long time, and over that period of time, they've been watching the land fall apart and the permafrost come undone and the river rip the place apart, and the erosion get closer and closer to the village. It's been kind of ominous. At the same time, the community's been one of the most proactive, one of the most, in a lot of ways, innovative in terms of figuring out how to do this kind of relocation. They're now really one of the first that's been able to do, they're about halfway there. They've moved half the community, but they've been able to do it successfully. And there's lots of other places in the country that are going to have to do this. They're going to have to just pick up and move. And so Newtok is kind of like a harbinger. It's a place that you can look at and think this is the future for a lot of places.
It's when you mentioned bureaucracy and also this is a crisis, and these people need to move, and the land is thawing, and the erosion, it's very serious. And I don't know why, but it just made me think of just a humorless person in an office saying like, sorry, you haven't filed your TS9-87 report, or you did it on the wrong date, and so you're not going to be able to make this request again until August next year. Like,
there's a little of that kind of technicality, but some of it is just that agencies aren't set up to move an entire community to a place that hasn't been inhabited before. And it's hard if you've never been out to these places to understand how incredibly remote they are. If you want to move someplace in the lower 48, like you go and buy a house and there's already roads and there's power lines and it's easy to put in a septic system and there's all sorts of things that are already there. But if you're setting up a community in Alaska, none of that's there. In these remote locations, the place that they moved to had nothing, no roads, no power, and so some of the struggle was because of that. And then there were things like, say you want to get funding for a particular thing, you need to show that a certain number of people are living there, but the people aren't going to live there until you have the infrastructure there to support them being able to live. And so it becomes kind of chicken and egg problem. And then on top of that, at one point they were trying to get disaster money, and they didn't qualify because it wasn't a screaming immediate crisis. Like they hadn't just gone through a hurricane or something. And so it didn't fit the definitions of disaster funding. And some of those definitions are starting to change, but at the time they had not. And so that's really complicated too. Like we have this idea that you shouldn't respond to something until after it's become kind of horrible, but that isn't really very good disaster planning, especially in an era of climate
Okay. Fair enough. I rescind my contempt for the imaginary Alaskan bureaucrat with the imaginary paperwork that I made up. So I'm sorry to any real Alaskan bureaucrat who really did not do the things that I just kind of acclaimed happened. I've seen Office Space too many times. That's what it was. It was um so okay, we've spent some time in Alaska. We spent some time in Florida. Let's go to you want to go to California real quick?
Sure.
Because can you tell me about Richmond, California, and just kind of like what's going on there? What's the history just a little bit, and uh, what are the people in that city trying to do to transform their home for the future?
So the story of Richmond closes out the book, and I put it there for a few different reasons. It's the story that brings together a lot of the different themes of the book, and it's also a place where people are really innovatively and creatively reimagining what their city can be. Richmond is a community that's built right next to 120 or really around a 120-year-old oil refinery that's run by Chevron. And that community grew up during the World War II era around all of this old industry. And then in the mid 20th century, things kind of start to fall apart. And for a lot of reasons to do with a combination of just the way that the American economy has gone in industrial areas, and also discrimination and environmental racism. People were left in a place that didn't have a lot of economic opportunity. In the 80s, the crack cocaine epidemic came, up and down the country and really ripped through this community and created a wave of suffering and crime. And the main person whose story I follow in this book is named Doria Robinson. She grew up in that period of time in the 80s. She grew up in a historic Black community that was very tight knit and was all about organizing things together to try to lift people up and to try to build things and train people with new kinds of educational opportunities, employment opportunities. And they were constantly having to deal with this stuff in the background of crime and overall poverty in the city. And then on top of that, pollution from the oil refinery. And in the 80s, there were some big incidents with the oil refinery and fires. And then she left and she came back and she decided to start this organization, get involved with this organization and then lead it, that would literally try to grow something new in this place. And I say literally because she started all these urban farms and they grew vegetables all around the city, and it's expanded into this really beautiful organization. And I think that gave people a vision of what else could happen there. And so it's along with that has been all of this other kind of economic development, green jobs, and some organic food companies moved into the city, and solar companies are in the city. And then in 2012, they had a big refinery fire, like one of the largest ones. And I think because people had been building all these new things and reimagining things, they were really angry. And some of the folks who were involved in these projects and some of the activists. And so it became a turning point where the city has since then, over time, been asking, what would it mean to not have an oil refinery here?
Yeah.
What would it mean to move away from this kind of economy? And I think it's a place where on a community scale, you can ask these big questions about how do we make the kinds of changes that we need to make in order to deal with this crisis? Because of course, at its root is our dependence on fossil fuels. So, and there are lots of community level and local decisions that we make about how we use all of that energy. And it was a place where I could tell that story and make people see it through the eyes of folks who've had to live with both the impacts and also had to, find ways to be optimistic and come up with new ideas.
Yeah, it's just, I mean, it's also just astounding, and not to go on a tangent, but just 40 years later, people just now finally growing out of the legacy of cruelty of the Ronald Reagan administration, and just, I don't know, so much of what you mentioned there, just his name is all over it to me, and that's like, I just I can't help but think of that, but also how important it is when you talk about on a local level, people imagining what will our city look like, what will our community look like without an oil refinery, and people all over the world need to start doing that, even in major petro states, and also in smaller, in countries that have less of a reliance on petroleum. But everyone's going to have to start thinking, like, what is our world going to look like once we get rid of these oil refineries, because they're not here to stay.
And I think one of the things about Richmond that makes it especially vivid is that people have both had to deal with these impacts of pollution. And also the city is still quite economically dependent on the refinery. A huge amount of the local revenue comes from taxes that the refinery pays. And so it's a real question. How do we get ourselves off of our dependence on this? And it's a question that reverberates across the country. We all, to one extent or another, are dependent on these things economically. And so I think sometimes we don't get real about how significant that kind of transition has to be, and sort of the amount of reimagining and the ways that we have to change how we built our communities. And there's lots of important questions we can ask about that. That are, I mean, I think we talk a lot about things like, how do we swap out our heat pump, and how do we swap out our furnace with a heat pump or something, and that's important too. But it's not just that. I mean, I think there's lots of questions we can be asking. About these transitions.
Yeah, it's important that you recycle your beer can or whatever, but it's more important that economists come up with some kind of solution to incentivize these energy companies to reduce carbon, to pump the oil back into the ground.
And I think probably the lesson of Richmond is that the incentive, in a lot of ways, may have to come from political pressure from the grassroots, because even at the state level, politicians are under a lot of pressure to make things easier for the industry. The oil industry is really important for California economically, and so it comes down to people at the grassroots standing up and saying, we want something different, and really holding politicians accountable. And you can see that happening in Richmond. You can see how their whole their whole city council turned over. It used to be all Chevron supporters, and now it's a majority of people who are very progressive and kind of anti-corporate, really, and are thinking about different ways to change the economic picture of the city. I should also say that Dory Robinson, the person that I just mentioned, whose story I follow, was just elected to the city council this last fall.
Oh, cool. Yeah.
Also, they're having a voice in how,
it's got to start somewhere. Why not Richmond, California? And I totally agree with you 100%. I could not agree more that it is grassroots. It has to be grassroots, political power, changing the landscape, because the people, these legacy energy companies and these dinosaur politicians that have been in there forever, they're not going to change. They're not going to change the way they do things. It's it's going to be up to us, and it's going to be up to the communities and the people that live on this planet. So I couldn't agree with, like I said, I agree with you 100% on grassroots. Madeline, I got to tell you something. We're getting dangerously close to the lightning round. Now, let me tell you how the lightning round works. I ask you a series of questions super fast. You've got no time to think. It is just straight up gut reaction. Just whatever the first thing that pops in your head, that's the answer. So, are you ready to play? It's kind of the game portion of the podcast. All right. Lightning round. Do you think the cartoon Captain Planet was effective at getting kids to care more about the environment?
I don't know. I was more of a Ranger Rick sort of person.
Okay.
Those are the magazines. They're the things that the environmental characters I pay attention to.
Well, I fair enough, but I've got good news for you. There's two more Captain Planet centric questions in a row we're out for this, and I've already written them, so you have to hear them. But you know what? They really switched up here. I mean, I switched them up. So, uh, do you think that if they made a Captain Planet movie reboot starring The Rock, would that make modern kids care more about the environment?
Oh, wow. Um, I don't know.
It
I feel
depends
like
on
I'm
who.
not.
I'm sorry. No, you go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, I just God, I don't know. I don't know how to answer this. I feel like I'm like the wrong person to ask about this sorts of stuff, but I will say that I do having awesome celebrities or goofy celebrities or whatever
Yeah.
talk to kids is good because kids often go back and talk to their parents and a
Okay.
lot. Yeah.
I'll take that as a yes.
Sure.
uh, a strong maybe. We'll put it as a strong maybe.
Okay.
Okay, moving on. This is the last Captain America, Captain Planet question. I'm sorry. There are no Captain America questions on here. Like I said earlier, I couldn't help but notice Kim Stanley Robinson, author of Ministry for the Future,
Uh-huh.
gave your book some very high praise.
Thank you.
And now I'm not saying I condone some of the hypothetical solutions to climate in that book. Like as some because he was also influenced by Andreas Malm for some of that. But let's just say that if there was a Captain Planet reboot starring The Rock, where he used where he used drone strikes to disable oil refineries, mining operations, and whaling vessels, would that inspire kids to care more about the environment?
Hmm. Do you think that anybody would distribute a film that showed people doing like maybe you could have some heroes attacking oil vessels? I feel like I have to be careful what I say here. Like you said, I
I mean,
like let's.
I think the future that Kim Stanley Robinson envisions is a future where people are pretty on board with sinking whaling ships and
Yeah,
super yachts and whatever it takes to
yeah,
get the
yeah,
air under control. So who
yeah.
knows? I don't know. I The Rock, if you're listening, Mr. Johnson, I mean Dwayne, if you could make this movie, I'd really be pleased. All right.
I would like to see a movie that has like sort of activist superheroes or like like activists as because I think that like activists are not well portrayed in like Hollywood things. They're often shown as being like kind of
Yeah. They're always
annoying and they're
they're like
whiny
villains.
and yeah. And I would love to see a movie for kids where like people are getting out and protesting and they're awesome and they're superheroes and they're like solving problems. And I think that could be great for the
Let me
climate. And actually, there are already some superhero kids like Greta Thunberg who are
Yes. No. Yeah. Oh my God. I was gonna ask you. It was a question I didn't put on the lightning round because the person that was near me while I was writing it said that was not a good question to ask. I was gonna ask, who do you think is the next person that Greta Thunberg should get locked up? Because
Hmm.
oh my God, that Andrew Tate trying to own her on Twitter
Oh God, that story
and and
was
going to
crazy,
prison.
incredible.
Oh!
Yeah.
May I please have one moment, one soapbox moment? I just want to bring up what you said about activists and environmentalists in Hollywood. This is something that I noticed even as a young person.
Uh-huh.
Is the movie Ghostbusters, which I love. I love the movie Ghostbusters. It's awesome. Who doesn't love the movie? But they make the villain, the one human villain, not the ghost villains. The main human villain is the EPA. It's the Environmental Protection Agency. I mean, they make the guy act like an asshole, and you don't
Got
like
this,
him.
but yeah. Uh-huh.
He's Shooter McGavin from Happy Gilmore, I think.
Uh-huh.
He comes in and he's basically trying to shut down the fact that they have a nuclear reactor in their like and they're like condemned building, and he's like, this is not safe for the environment, and they're like, he's an asshole, kick him out of here. Like, so Hollywood has a long history of treating environmentalists poorly. Anyway, moving on to more Hollywood stuff. Celebrity environmentalist face off. Leonardo DiCaprio versus Matt Damon. Who do you pick?
Oh wow. I guess Leonardo. I don't
Yeah,
know.
he's like an animal guy. So am I. So I know Matt Damon's like he's like a water guy. That's kind of more his thing, right? Clean
Yeah,
water.
I think so. And he's done some stuff on fracking, I believe. Yeah.
But you know what? He did kind of tarnish himself with that Bitcoin shit. So which is like one of like, and people don't think about this often, but Bitcoin is one of the most evil towards the environment creations of all time. It's like
Yeah.
literally a machine that destroys the planet and makes imaginary money.
Mhm. There was a story about a coal plant reopening because of cryptocurrency.
Oh
Like,
God.
so yes, those things are kind of a disaster in and of themselves.
Matt Damon, you lose. Leonardo DiCaprio wins environmentalist face offs, celebrity environmentalist face off. All right. Here's a tough one. And you might say neither. I don't know. If you could magically shut down either the cruise ship industry or the industrial fishing industry, which one would you choose?
That's complicated. It depends on what you mean by the industrial fishing industry. I think that so okay. Here on the Pacific Northwest, we have these commercially run tribal fishing companies, and I think if I can make the country like all that, because they do an amazing job. Like they do all this like habitat restoration, so like and just advocacy in support of salmon habitat and shellfish and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So I mean, if we could have like responsible industrial fishing, that would be awesome. And actually, one of the fun moments in Kim Stanley Robinson's book is when he talks about one of the main characters going on a trip, I think in like a blimp across the country.
Yeah.
If we could just change how people go on tours, if they could just
Yeah.
sail around the world instead of being on big, you know, polluting ships, then I'd be all for that. Maybe we
I
just need to rethink how these things work.
it's funny that we're bringing up so Ministry for the Future was actually like, it's a very impactful book to me because I think I was becoming a real cynic. And I read that book a couple of years ago, and it really got me back on track of being like, you know what, with enough people and enough energy, and here we are. You're like, you know, you're writing nonfiction, and Kim Stanley Robinson's like out here saying like, hell yeah, Madeline Ostrander, listen to her. So, so, okay, this one's a really tough one, and you can even, I mean, I don't know, it's almost a playing God question. So I'm gonna, if you could bring back one extinct species, which one would you bring back?
Oh wow. Um, hmm. I mean, that's really tough. I think that I'd have to like go like get it together a bunch of ecologists or something and like have a big conference about it or something. Because I
Yeah,
think there's some species that have gone away that were really important for keeping, you know, the planet
yeah, for
in
sure.
check. Um, so
Some kind
these
of
folks aren't extinct, but like some of the big predators in the country, like grizzlies and wolves and stuff, and black panthers, like if we could like bring those back in a much bigger way, I think we'd have a healthier country,
yeah.
even though I feel a lot of complaints about it from some parts of the country. But
Okay, I'll make
yeah.
I'll change the question because it really
Uh-huh.
was that it was kind of a crazy question. And also it is like, what am I even saying? Am I saying that we're going to clone the animal, or you know, or
Right,
like,
there's a weird idea that like of trying to re-engineer mastodons or something through genetic,
yeah,
and I find those a little dubious, but
yeah, we're getting into Jurassic Park territory. So I'll rephrase the question. You can take one endangered species, you have the power and whatever resources it takes. You could get that, you could pick any endangered species on the planet and get them off the endangered species list for good. What animal would you pick?
so since this is a lightning round, this is just off the top of my head, but like North Cascades National Park is legit talking about bringing back grizzly bears, and I'm pretty excited about that. So I feel like having grizzlies in places that they didn't used to be, or
Yeah.
sorry, not didn't used to be, that they used to be and aren't anymore would be exciting. I mean, not that I want to like, go hang out in close each one, but but
Yeah. Yeah.
they're
I
important. They're important, on the landscape. They do a lot to keep ecosystems.
I have a very similar to you. Like I love them as I just love them as an idea. As like I love reading like native mythologies about grizzly bears. They're super important. I
Mhm.
would love to bring them back to all of their territory. But yeah, I don't ever want to really get super hella close to a grizzly bear ever in my life.
I guess I could also put in there like Chinook salmon because they're like a huge part of the ecosystem out here in Seattle and for orcas and everything. So
Yeah.
um bring back salmon to the levels that they were before. And I mean salmon are still really important here, but like salmon populations were massive when this part of the country was first, when European Americans first came out here. There are huge amounts of salmon and it would be amazing to see
Yeah.
that.
It's such a tough question too, because like I haven't like just watched a nature documentary, but if I had, like, they're always like Sir David Attenborough. I've been like, now this such and such type of fox has become endangered, and I'm screaming at the TV, no, no. So it's so I don't have any on my mind particularly. Grizzlies always on my mind.
Mm.
Madeline, I only have one last question to ask you, and it's the most important question of the day, and it's this: where can people check you out? Where can they find your book? Everything they need to know.
So the easiest one-stop shop is probably my website, which is just madelineostrander.com. But the book is available all sorts of places. If you walk into your friendly independent bookstore that's, down the road from you and say, I really want to read this book, they might have it in stock. And if they don't, they might order it for you. And if you say, this is really great and you should have lots of them on your shelf, then
Yeah.
that's also helps me out. Yeah.
You heard it, guys. Go to the local bookshop. If they only have one, buy it and tell them to get 50 more.
Exactly. Thank you.
Madeline, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the podcast today.
Thank you. It was a lot of fun.